Okay, so we're back for another deep dive, and this one is something I think a lot of our listeners are going to find really, really relevant. We're talking about dogs.
Dogs, yes. Man's best friend.
Well, sometimes, maybe not so much, right? Like
Right.
when they're chewing on your favorite shoes or, deciding that the sofa is actually a giant chew toy.
Yeah. Or that 3.0 a.m. is the perfect time for a barking concert.
Exactly. So we're diving into this whole idea of how do we take those frustrating dog behaviors, those things that make you wonder if you've got a little furry demon in your house, and how do we actually shift those into behaviors that we as humans find a little bit more delightful?
Yeah, and actually, I think that's a good point because when you look at the research we've got for this deep dive, it really emphasizes that it's not about the dog being inherently bad. It's often about us as their human companions, maybe not quite setting them up for success.
Right. Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about this. Is like the stuff we dug into this week really underscores that with the right kind of training, the right environment, and understanding how dogs tick, we can actually unlock a whole different side of them.
Absolutely, yeah.
So where do we begin with this? Like, let's say you've got a dog who's constantly pushing boundaries. Where's the starting point?
Well, I think one of the most fundamental things our sources emphasize is this idea of structure. Like, dogs really, really thrive on structure.
Structure, huh? Why is that so crucial for them?
Well, if you think about it, way back in their history, their wolf ancestors, they lived in packs,
Right.
right? And packs have very clear hierarchies. Everyone has their role, everyone knows the rules, and that actually reduces a lot of stress and anxiety because everyone knows where they fit in.
So it's kind of like having that predictability takes away the guesswork.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're not constantly having to figure out, okay, what am I supposed to do here?
That makes sense. So if we don't provide that structure, like in our modern human homes, what's the fallout? Like, how do dogs react to that lack of a framework?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said fallout, because it really can be. Like one of the things that happens is they get confused. They genuinely don't know what's expected of them. So they get anxious, they get stressed.
Because the rules feel inconsistent, right?
Yeah, totally inconsistent. And that's where you start to see a lot of those behaviors that drive us up the wall. The chewing, the digging, the barking.
Hmm.
Often, that's a dog trying to say, hey, I'm stressed out here. I don't know what to do with myself.
And then there's that phrase testing boundaries, which I think a lot of dog owners are probably familiar with.
Oh, yeah, it's a classic, right? But what's interesting is, if you think about it from the dog's perspective, they're not necessarily trying to be defiant. They're just trying to figure out, okay, where's the line here? What can I get away with? What are the rules?
So how do we know if our dog is like genuinely lacking structure? Like
Yeah.
what are some signs we should be paying attention to?
Well, the material had this really neat little checklist. One thing is, if your dog's just constantly overexcited, like they can't seem to settle down, or if they're ignoring commands they already know, like they've totally mastered sit, but suddenly they're looking at you like sit. What's that?
Like selective hearing kicks in.
Exactly. Or another thing is, if they start guarding their toys or food, getting really possessive, that can be a sign they're not feeling secure about resources. And then, of course, there's the obvious one, the destructive behavior, especially when they're left alone.
That makes sense. So once we realize, okay, maybe structure is the missing piece here, how do we start putting that in place? What's the approach?
So this is where positive reinforcement really comes in. And I know it's a buzzword these days, but it's so important to understand what it really means. It's about moving away from punishment, the old school yelling or smacking, and instead focusing on rewarding the behaviors we want to see.
And why is that shift so crucial?
Well, for one thing, punishment might stop a behavior in the moment, but it doesn't actually teach the dog what they should be doing.
It just kind of shuts things down without providing an alternative.
Exactly. And what's even more important is that it can really damage your relationship with your dog. They start to associate you with fear and anxiety, and that can actually lead to more behavioral problems down the road.
So positive reinforcement is about building trust and communication, not just obedience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's so simple at its core. You basically just reward your dog when they do something you like. So let's say they sit when you ask. You mark that moment with a word like yes, or a clatter if you use one, and then immediately give them a treat, praise, or a quick game of fetch. And the clicker's interesting because it creates this really precise association between the sound and the reward.
It's like, aha, that click means good things are coming.
Exactly. And you're not just giving them treats either, you're also using things like praise and play. You're making them want to behave well because it leads to fun and positive experiences.
So it's about understanding what really motivates your individual dog, right? Because what one dog finds rewarding, another might be totally indifferent to.
Yeah, totally. Like some dogs are crazy for food, others go bonkers for a good game of tug of war. It's all about figuring out what makes your dog tick.
Now, something else that really stood out to me in this research was the emphasis on mental stimulation. Like, why is that such a big deal?
Okay, so think about it this way. We all know that a tired dog is a good dog, right? But there's actually two kinds of tired,
Mm.
physically tired and mentally tired. And mental tiredness, that deep satisfaction of having used your brain, that's where the magic happens.
So it's not just about wearing them out physically.
Nope. You can take your dog for a 5-mile run,
Yeah.
and they might be physically exhausted, but their mind's still going, okay, what can I get into now?
Yeah.
But if you give them a good puzzle toy or a challenging training session, that mental fatigue just chills them out in a way that physical exercise alone can't.
It's like they've had a good mental workout.
Exactly. And remember, a lot of dogs were bred for jobs that required them to think, like herding or tracking. So when they don't have those outlets, all that mental energy can get misdirected.
And that's where the trouble starts.
Yep. So the key is to give them healthy ways to use their brains. Things like food puzzles where they have to figure out how to get the treats out, or teaching them new tricks, or even just hiding their toys around the house for them to sniff out.
So we've got structure, positive reinforcement, and mental stimulation. It sounds like these are the three pillars of creating a well-behaved dog.
You got it.
But how do we actually put this all into practice?
Well, the first thing is to get really clear on communication. And this means being consistent with your cues. So always use the same word for the same command. Don't switch it up or you'll just confuse your dog.
And this applies to everyone in the house, right? Not just the primary trainer.
Absolutely. Everyone needs to be on the same page. And use a marker, like a clicker or word like yes, to tell your dog exactly when they did the right thing. And then, of course, you have to set clear boundaries. And stick to them. Dogs thrive on predictability, so if the rules keep changing, they're never going to know what's expected of them.
So consistency is key across the board.
It's like the golden rule of dog training. And a big part of that is routine. Set regular feeding times, schedule short training sessions throughout the day, have a consistent sleep schedule, and make sure they get a good mix of physical and mental exercise every day.
It sounds like a good routine benefits everyone, human and canine.
Totally. And the article actually lays out a really neat plan for those first critical 30 days.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
So week 1 is all about the basics. You focus on establishing clear communication, teaching 1 or 2 fundamental commands like sit and come, and just getting those routines in place.
So laying the foundation.
Exactly. And then in week 2, you start to build on that. You add a little more complexity to those commands, introduce a couple of new ones, and start working on training with very mild distractions, like maybe having someone walk past while your dog is practicing stay.
And then week 3.
Week 3 is all about proofing. So you take those learned behaviors and start practicing them in different environments with gradually increasing levels of distraction, like maybe taking your training sessions to the park or having friends over while you practice.
So making sure those behaviors are rock solid no matter what's going on around them.
Exactly. And then in week 4, you start integrating those individual commands into more complex sequences, like maybe having your dog sit, then down, then stay. And you really focus on applying your training to real-life situations.
That's so smart, like bringing it all together.
Yeah, exactly. And the article had these really cool case studies that showed how all this works in the real world. Like there was this dog, Max, a 2-year-old border collie mix, who was just a holy terror, chewing on everything, destroying furniture, you name it.
Oh no, sounds like a nightmare.
It was rough. But his new owners were amazing. They realized he was just super smart and bored, so they gave him 3 short training sessions a day, made him wear a backpack on walks to give him a job, and introduced puzzle feeders and scent work.
So they really tapped into his brain power.
They did, and it made a huge difference. Within 3 weeks, his destructive behavior had decreased by like 90%. It was incredible.
Wow. So sometimes those bad behaviors are just a dog trying to say, hey, I need more mental stimulation.
Exactly. And then there was Bella, this 4-year-old rescue, who was super reactive, lunging and barking at other dogs and going crazy when people came over.
Oh, reactive dogs can be so tough to handle.
They can be. But her owners were awesome. They were really consistent with commands, taught her a calm greeting behavior for visitors, and rewarded her for staying calm around triggers. And within 6 weeks, she was like a different dog. She could pass other dogs without freaking out, and she'd politely greet people at the door instead of jumping all over them.
That's really inspiring. It shows that with the right approach, even big behavioral issues can be tackled.
Totally. And the article gives some really practical tips for getting started, like start small, pick one or two behaviors you want to work on, and practice in a low distraction environment.
So don't try to do too much too soon.
Exactly. And remember, consistency is key. Everyone in the house needs to be on board and use the same rules and cues. Otherwise, you'll just confuse your dog. And don't forget to make it fun. Training should be enjoyable for both of you. And on a positive note, incorporate play and keep in mind that you're building a relationship, not just training a robot.
And I think what really resonated with me from all this is that it's not about dominance or force. It's about understanding your dog, giving them what they need, and communicating clearly.
Yeah, it's about meeting their needs so they can be the best version of themselves.
And the takeaway here is that with a little patience, consistency, and the right tools, pretty much any dog can be transformed. Like that 30-day plan, it's a great roadmap for anyone who's feeling overwhelmed and doesn't know where to start.
Absolutely. And their final thought, and it's a good one, is that if you've got a naughty dog, try not to think of them as broken. They're just waiting for you to give them the guidance they need to shine.
I love that. So, for our listeners out there, what's one small step you can take today to start understanding your dog better and unlocking their potential?
That's the question. Think about it.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.
Bye.